Under the pale light of an early morning, Ethan Cross steered his rental truck down the cracked county road, the wheels crunching against loose gravel, his mind caught between anticipation and a quiet unease he could not entirely explain. It had been years since he last set foot in this valley, years since he had thought seriously about the parcel of land his family had owned for generations, a place once thriving with cattle and crops, later abandoned when his father fell ill and the family scattered. He had spent the last decade in Europe working as an agricultural consultant, moving between vineyards and olive farms, carrying notebooks filled with soil analyses and irrigation strategies. But in the end, the work, as stimulating as it was, had never quite silenced the memory of this ranch, the dry wind that used to whistle across the fences, and the weight of his grandfather's stories about land that no one could ever take away because it was written into the family's name since the 19th century. That was why, when the letter arrived from the county notifying him that the estate, long untended, required new registration under his ownership, he booked a flight back, determined to restore something tangible, something he could finally call his own without compromise. As the valley unfolded before him, Ethan slowed the truck and blinked in disbelief. The wide pasture land he remembered, with its faded posts leaning like weary soldiers and the ruins of an old barn sinking into weeds, was no longer an empty expanse waiting for him to reclaim. Instead, a neat little street cut right through the property, lined with houses painted in identical shades of beige, with picket fences and decorative shrubs, mailboxes neatly aligned as if designed by a single hand. Children's bicycles leaned against garage doors. A dog barked from behind a trimmed hedge, and the smell of barbecued meat drifted faintly from somewhere down the block, though it was not even noon. For a moment, Ethan thought he had made a wrong turn, that he had mistaken the road, but the outline of the hills in the distance, the curve of the riverbank on the left, and the unmistakable shape of the collapsed windmill proved he was in the right place. His land had been transformed, as if erased from memory and rewritten into a suburbia that had no business standing here. He parked by what should have been the old ranch house site, though the building was long gone, replaced by a tidy single-story home with vinyl siding. Ethan stepped out, walked a few paces across the cracked earth, and crouched where his grandfather's porch once stood, running his hand through the dirt as if to reassure himself that beneath all these houses, the soil was still the same. His thoughts tumbled. Had the land been sold while he was away? Had some administrative mistake shifted boundaries? Or was this all some elaborate misunderstanding? The deed folded in his bag said otherwise, and he knew too well the history of inheritance, the dates and signatures recorded meticulously by his late father, who insisted on never letting the papers out of the family's safe. As he stood, a voice cut through the air, brisk and almost cheerful. "You're trespassing," a woman said, striding across the cul-de-sac with the authority of someone who believed the street was her stage. She introduced herself simply as Karen, claiming the small cabin at the edge of the lake, Ethan's old storage shed turned into a lakeside rental, was hers, and that if Ethan intended to stay around, he would need to pay rent like everyone else who used her property. Ethan stared at her, momentarily speechless, then explained calmly that the cabin was built on the foundation of his grandfather's stables, that this land had been in his family since before her house was even imagined. Karen laughed, not the nervous kind, but the laugh of someone who knew she could bend rules without consequence, and told him to check the records if he doubted her words, because the street, the homes, and the cabin were all part of a collective arrangement she oversaw. She waved her hand at the neighborhood as if it were a model she had designed, then reminded him in the same brisk tone that rent was due at the start of the month, and walked away without waiting for his response. Ethan stood frozen, his hand tightening around the deed in his pocket, the weight of her casual dismissal heavier than any threat. He glanced around at the street, at the windows where curtains twitched slightly, at the neighbors who avoided his gaze, at the asphalt that sliced through what was once his pasture. The introduction to his land had become an introduction to something much darker, a place where ownership and memory collided with a reality manufactured in his absence, where even the soil beneath his boots seemed ready to deny his claim. When Ethan woke the next morning in the small guest house he had rented a few miles away from his property, his mind was still gnawing on Karen's words, turning them over as if each syllable carried some hidden code he had failed to decipher. He had slept poorly, restless with images of the houses that now dotted the land he remembered as endless pasture, the slow motion of his grandfather's cattle once grazing where now manicured lawns stretched, the sound of children playing basketball, where the corral gates used to creak in the wind. It was not just disorientation, but a sharp dissonance, the sort that makes the body feel misplaced inside its own skin, as though he were trespassing on his own memory. The deed, folded neatly inside his leather satchel, seemed to grow heavier with each thought, pressing against him like a reminder of obligation and betrayal at once. By mid-morning, Ethan decided speculation was pointless. He drove straight to the county land records office, a squat brick building that smelled of mildew and paper dust. The receptionist, a thin man with an expression carved in permanent indifference, slid a form across the counter when Ethan explained his request, barely lifting his eyes. After filling in the parcel number, Ethan waited as the clerk tapped at an old keyboard, squinting at the screen with a frown that deepened until he finally muttered, "Strange." He disappeared into the back room, leaving Ethan staring at the scuffed linoleum, and returned 10 minutes later with a stack of documents that looked too slim for land that had been in the same family for over a century. The file showed the original title deed, his grandfather's signature, his father's transfer papers, all as expected. But stapled at the back were new documents Ethan had never seen before, a provisional development authorization, stamped 12 years ago, listing the area as unused public land allocated for community housing initiative. Ethan's name was nowhere. Nor was his father's. Instead, the owner was listed as Lakewood Collective, a name that immediately set his stomach into a knot because it echoed Karen's casual reference to some collective arrangement. The authorization did not have a proper county seal. Instead, it bore the mark of an obscure subcommittee that, as Ethan quickly realized, no longer existed. It was as if the papers were ghosts of a bureaucracy long dissolved, leaving behind just enough ink to look legitimate to anyone who did not examine closely. He pressed the clerk for explanations, but the man shrugged. If the system says it was allocated, then it was. You can always file a dispute. The tone was final, bureaucratic dismissal masquerading as advice. Ethan signed out the copies, his hands trembling slightly, and carried them to the parking lot where he spread them across the hood of his truck. The dates, the stamps, the vague language, it all reeked of deliberate vagueness. No signatures from his family, no notices ever sent to their address, no record of an auction or transfer. The authorization seemed to exist only to justify the fact that houses had sprouted where they should not. That evening, Ethan returned to the property, determined to confront Karen directly. She was standing outside her cabin, watering potted plants arranged in symmetrical order, as though the act of arranging life in perfect rows was her method of taming what was never hers. Ethan approached and presented the papers, asking how she could claim rent on land that was indisputably his by deed. She looked at the documents with a disinterested glance, then laughed softly, shaking her head as though he were a naive newcomer to a game everyone else had been playing for years. She told him the collective had been maintaining this street for over a decade, that the houses were financed under agreements with private investors, and that he was late to the table. She said it not with malice, but with that infuriating smugness of someone who believed time itself had granted her legitimacy. When Ethan insisted the documents were invalid, pointing to the missing seals and unauthorized committee, Karen's smile grew thinner. She leaned closer and whispered, almost conspiratorially, that courts rarely cared about technicalities when families had lived in homes for years, when children had been born under those roofs, when property taxes had been paid without fail. Judges see stability, not old paperwork, she said as though reciting a mantra. You think your deed means something, but your family abandoned this land. We gave it life. Then, with a theatrical wave of her hand toward the street, she added, Try taking it back. You'll see how far you get. Her words followed him like a bitter taste as he walked away, but worse was the subtle shifting he noticed among the neighbors. Curtains fluttered, doors clicked shut, and by the time he reached his truck he could feel the weight of a dozen silent eyes watching. The street had already taken sides, and he was on the outside. That night, while rereading the papers in the dim glow of his desk lamp, Ethan noticed something even more unsettling. The provisional authorization referred to the land not as ranch, but as vacant. The choice of word was not accidental. It erased generations of history in a single stroke, turning his family's neglect during illness into abandonment, rewriting ownership into vacancy. He realized with chilling clarity that Karen's arrogance was not rooted only in personality. It was anchored in a system willing to accept her narrative over his evidence. The next morning, a letter was slid under the door of his guest house. The envelope bore no return address, only his name scrawled in an angular hand. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed in a sterile font. Lakewood Collective recognizes your interest. Continued interference will result in penalties assessed against your use of shared infrastructure. There was no signature, only a stamp that matched the one on the dubious authorization papers. Ethan stared at it until the letters blurred, realizing he had just been formally warned not to interfere with what was legally his. The catalyst was no longer Karen's demand for rent or her smug dismissal of his deed. It was the discovery that her claim was not an isolated act of audacity, but part of a larger machinery, a collective that had paper trails, however questionable, and neighbors ready to defend them. The battle had shifted from one woman's arrogance to a shadowy framework that had somehow legitimized itself, and Ethan knew with a sinking certainty that he was about to step into a war far more intricate than a property dispute. It was a war for narrative, for definition, for the right to decide what was vacant and what was alive, who was owner and who was intruder. Ethan knew that ignoring the warning letter would be foolish, but something inside him refused to yield, a stubborn spark that grew stronger the more Karen tried to assert authority over land that had been his family's anchor for more than a century. Instead of retreating, he spent the following days visiting every office in the county that might shed light on the strange collective and the way it had attached itself to his ranch. What he discovered was not clarity but a labyrinth of vague answers, unhelpful clerks and digital records riddled with gaps, as if whole chapters had been quietly erased or buried. Each time he asked who had approved the development of the street, he was told to speak to another department, and each referral ended in another locked drawer, another shrug, another phrase like, "That committee was dissolved years ago," or "those." Records were transferred elsewhere. It became evident that whether by incompetence or design, there was no single point of accountability, no simple form he could file that would make the problem disappear. One afternoon, after hours of waiting in the courthouse annex, Ethan finally caught a deputy assessor on his break and pressed him with questions. The man lowered his voice and told him off the record that Lakewood Collective had a reputation for operating in gray zones, maintaining neighborhoods that technically should not exist, built on parcels declared vacant through administrative shortcuts. "It's not illegal if nobody fights it," the man muttered before walking away, leaving Ethan with the sour taste of the confirmation. The system was not built to protect him. It was built to move forward without asking whose footprints were buried under the asphalt. Determined not to be intimidated, Ethan returned to his ranch and found Karen waiting, standing on the edge of his gravel driveway with her arms crossed. She asked if he had reconsidered paying rent, her tone sweet, but her eyes sharp. When he refused, she raised her voice just loud enough for a pair of neighbors to overhear, accusing him of trying to displace families who had invested their savings into these homes. Her words carried an easy authority, as if rehearsed, and Ethan realized with a chill that she was not just protecting her own interests, but shaping a story for the entire street, painting him as an intruder threatening their stability. Within days, the pressure escalated. Small inconveniences began to accumulate. His access to the road was restricted when residents parked vehicles deliberately across the entrance. Garbage mysteriously appeared near the boundary of his land, and a contractor he had hired to assess the condition of the soil backed out at the last minute, apologizing that he couldn't risk upsetting the neighborhood. Ethan noticed how neighbors avoided eye contact, how conversations hushed when he walked by, and how every step he took felt like trespassing through a hostile territory that was once his sanctuary. The escalation was not loud or violent, but insidious, a slow tightening of the noose through social pressure and quiet obstruction. Still, Ethan was not alone. He managed to speak discreetly with an elderly resident named Paul, who admitted that when the houses were first built, there had been whispered doubts about the legality of the project. Paul confided that the original buyers had been told the land was part of a reassignment zone, and that deeds would be formalized later, but most were too eager for affordable housing near the lake to ask questions. Now, after living here for years, raising children and paying dues to the collective, they could not afford to admit the truth, that they might be living on someone else's land. "We built our lives here," Paul said with weary resignation. "Even if it was wrong from the start, no one wants to tear it all down." His words struck Ethan harder than Karen's arrogance because they carried the weight of human lives entangled in a lie too big to unravel without collateral damage. The collective seemed to sense Ethan's growing determination, and their tactics became bolder. One morning he discovered a bright orange notice taped to the rusted gate of his property, declaring his driveway a shared access route subject to maintenance fees. The language was absurd, claiming that his private entrance was now part of communal infrastructure. When Ethan tore it down, Karen appeared almost instantly, flanked by two men from the neighborhood, her voice ringing out with mock sympathy as she accused him of vandalizing public notices. The men stood silently, their presence a quiet intimidation, and Ethan felt the invisible line shifting once more. This was no longer an argument about documents, but about control, about who could command the narrative in front of watching eyes. He tried once more to reason, producing his deed and demanding they acknowledge it, but Karen laughed as if deeds were relics from another era. She spoke instead about continuous use, about how the community had maintained the land openly and without interruption, and how the law recognized possession that was lived, not just signed. Ethan recognized the tactic: adverse possession, a doctrine that turned absence into surrender. His family's decades of neglect had become the collective's weapon, and Karen wielded it with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed this battle long before he returned. That night, as he sat in the dim light of his guest house, Ethan spread the documents across the table once again, the deed on one side, the dubious authorizations on the other, and in the middle the anonymous letter warning him to stay away. He realized the escalation was not random but coordinated, each step designed to push him closer to surrender. The rent demand was the opening gambit, the notices and social pressure the next moves, and soon there would be something sharper, something designed to corner him completely. For the first time, he felt the weight of isolation pressing against him, the uneasy knowledge that the battle was no longer about property lines but about endurance, about who could withstand the slow grind of pressure without breaking. And yet, beneath the exhaustion, another feeling stirred, a cold, steady anger that refused to yield. The collective had underestimated him, assuming he would fold under intimidation, but Ethan had no intention of abandoning the land his grandfather had walked, no intention of letting Karen's smile rewrite history. The first escalation had begun, and though he did not yet know the shape of the war to come, he knew one truth with absolute clarity: they had chosen the wrong man to erase. The morning broke gray and heavy, the kind of lightless sky that made the air feel denser, as if the whole valley were holding its breath, and Ethan sat in his truck staring at the windshield without starting the engine, his mind circling endlessly around the evidence scattered across the passenger seat. The deed, yellowed and frayed along the edges but stamped with unquestionable authority, lay beneath the dubious development authorization that bore the mark of a long-vanished committee, and beside them rested the anonymous letter that had warned him to stay away. He felt the pieces hovering close enough to suggest a pattern, yet still refusing to lock together. And the more he tried to make sense of it, the more it felt like the truth was being concealed not by lies but by deliberate vagueness, by language and loopholes that twisted reality until even facts looked unstable. He knew that if he approached the situation as a lone landowner, no one would take him seriously, so he decided to find someone who could read these documents not as emotional stakes, but as weapons, in a fight defined entirely by precision, precedent, and patience. By noon, he sat in a cramped office above a bakery in the town square, where a property attorney named Laura Mitchell listened quietly while he laid everything out, from Karen's brazen rent demands to the hostile presence of neighbors who treated him like an invader on his own soil. Laura was younger than he expected. Her desk cluttered with case files, her hair pulled into a practical knot, and her eyes sharp with the habit of dissecting details that others skimmed past. She did not laugh at his story, nor did she reassure him with platitudes. Instead, she asked for every page, every stamp, every reference number. When she spread the documents across her desk, she leaned so close her breath fogged the paper, and then she tapped at the provisional authorization with a fingertip. "This stamp," she said, her tone calm but edged with interest, "is from a subcommittee that was dissolved in 2008 after an audit exposed irregularities in their handling of land reassignment. If this authorization is dated 2011, then whoever issued it did so without authority, which makes it void. But if it was entered into county records and no one contested it, the collective may argue it became de facto accepted." Ethan felt a wave of both relief and dread because her words confirmed what he suspected. The foundation of Karen's claim was built on something shaky, but the system's inertia had allowed it to stand. Laura leaned back in her chair, folding her hands, and told him that cases like this were battles of endurance, where courts often favored the party that looked most settled, the one with families, mortgages, and taxes already paid, over the individual waving an old deed. But, she added, her eyes narrowing, they slipped. The language here misidentifies the land as public vacant, yet your family never relinquished ownership. That discrepancy is not cosmetic. It undermines their entire narrative. If we can show the court that the authorization was based on a false premise, the whole structure collapses. For the first time since returning to the valley, Ethan felt something resembling clarity, though it came laced with the cold recognition of how uphill the climb would be. He agreed to retain Laura, who immediately began drafting an injunction to prevent the collective from formalizing further claims. Over the following days, Ethan watched as she dug through archives, pulling forgotten records from microfilm reels, and discovered letters his father had sent to the county during his illness, inquiries about taxation that had gone unanswered. Among them was a reply, curt and dismissive, from a junior clerk who had misfiled the ranch as inactive. That single clerical choice had likely triggered the entire cascade, reducing a living inheritance to a vacancy ripe for exploitation. The realization settled in Ethan's chest like a stone. His absence abroad, his father's illness, the years of silence, all of it had given the collective room to breathe life into their fiction. And yet the paper trail was flawed, filled with fractures that could be pried open if only someone had the will to pursue them. Laura urged caution, warning that pressing too hard would escalate hostilities, but Ethan insisted there was no alternative. The street was already hostile, the neighbors already aligned against him, and Karen was already maneuvering as though victory were inevitable. The only path was forward. Tension deepened almost immediately. Within days of Laura filing preliminary motions, Ethan found another notice taped to his gate. This one not from the collective, but from the county zoning board, claiming that his use of the land was under review for compliance with community development ordinances. It was clear someone had triggered a formal complaint, and while the language was wrapped in bureaucratic neutrality, Ethan recognized Karen's fingerprints in every word. He presented the notice to Laura, who shook her head in frustration but also smiled grimly, remarking that counter-pressure was a sign they were being taken seriously. Still, the escalation gnawed at him, the way it forced him into constant defense, as if each step forward meant 3 steps of resistance. Late one evening, exhausted and restless, Ethan drove out to the lake where his grandfather's stable once stood, the structure now transformed into Karen's so-called cabin. He parked and walked the perimeter, studying the foundation stones that still bore the markings his grandfather had carved decades ago, initials and dates scratched into limestone as if to anchor memory against the erosion of time. He crouched and traced them with his fingers, feeling the grooves beneath the layers of paint and plaster the collective had used to mask them. It was evidence, silent but undeniable, that the land carried a story predating every house on the street. Standing there under the dim spill of moonlight, Ethan understood the importance of reclaiming not only the deed, but the narrative itself. If he allowed Karen's version to stand unchallenged, history itself would shift, and his family's presence would be swallowed whole. The following week brought an unexpected turn when a package arrived at Laura's office containing photocopies of letters that had never been filed publicly. They were unsigned, sent anonymously, but clearly originated from within the collective itself. The letters discussed strategies to maintain cohesion, and referenced the risk of external claims challenging the integrity of the street. One even mentioned Karen by name, noting her usefulness in controlling the narrative with residents. Though the letters were not admissible as formal evidence, they were a crack in the facade, a glimpse behind the curtain that confirmed what Ethan already felt. This was not a neighborhood protecting itself, but a coordinated effort orchestrated by a small group who knew they were balancing on a legal tightrope. Ethan read and reread the letters, his anger sharpening into resolve, but also his awareness of danger deepening. If someone inside the collective was leaking information, it meant not everyone was loyal, yet it also meant lines of trust were blurring, and those responsible for the scheme might react with desperation when exposed. The midpoint of his battle was no longer about questioning whether he had the right to fight. It was about recognizing the scale of what he was up against, a structure built not on fairness but on manipulation, where every neighbor was both victim and participant. Driving back to his guest house one evening, Ethan caught sight of Karen standing in the glow of her porch light, speaking animatedly to a group of neighbors who nodded solemnly as she gestured in his direction, painting him once more as the villain. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met, and her smile was not the brittle mask she usually wore, but something colder, almost triumphant, as if she knew the battle had shifted to a stage larger than either of them. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tighter, understanding at last that this was not a dispute that could be resolved with a single document or conversation. This was war by attrition, a contest of endurance where truth alone would not be enough unless he had the strength to wield it relentlessly. The injunction Laura had filed seemed at first to offer Ethan a thin shield, a pause in the momentum that the collective had been building, but shields were meant to be tested, and within a week the next escalation arrived, not in the form of quiet notices taped to gates or whispered accusations among neighbors, but as a deliberate tightening of the net around every aspect of his daily life. It began with the road, that single stretch of asphalt cutting through what was once open pasture, the only route by which Ethan could bring equipment, materials, or even groceries to his property. One morning, he found it blocked, not by accident, but by design. 3 vehicles belonging to different residents parked in such a way that his truck could not pass. He waited, assuming the obstruction would clear, but the owners never appeared, and when he knocked on doors, the responses were curt, dismissive, or met with silence. The message was unmistakable. His access was not guaranteed, not welcome, not recognized. When he finally managed to squeeze through after hours of waiting, he caught sight of a Karen standing by her mailbox, her posture relaxed, her smile carrying the ease of someone who knew the inconvenience had been orchestrated perfectly. The following days brought new tactics. A letter arrived claiming that his water access, drawn from a well that had existed on the ranch for generations, was subject to communal oversight, because it fell within the perimeter of Lakewood's resource management plan. The absurdity of the claim nearly made Ethan laugh, but Laura warned him not to dismiss it so lightly because such assertions, once made repeatedly, had a way of becoming accepted by officials who preferred consistency over confrontation. Soon after, he noticed workers, contractors hired by the collective, laying down bright utility flags along the boundary of his land, marking out lines for what they called infrastructure maintenance. He confronted them, demanding to see permits, but they waived vague work orders signed by the collective and refused to answer further questions. Their presence, their equipment, and the bright plastic flags slicing across his soil all spoke the same language: possession through action, dominance by doing. The pressure extended beyond the land itself. Ethan began to receive letters not from the collective but from county departments he had never interacted with before, taxation notices recalculated with sudden surcharges, zoning reviews triggered by anonymous complaints, even an environmental impact inquiry regarding the supposed misuse of wetlands. Each letter required responses, forms, deadlines, and fees, consuming hours of his time and draining the focus he needed for the actual battle over ownership. Laura explained that this tactic was common in disputes where one side held numerical superiority. Bury the opponent in paper, exhaust their energy, and create enough procedural smoke to obscure the central fire. She encouraged him to keep meticulous records, to respond to every notice even when it seemed trivial, because silence could be interpreted as concession. The neighbors, too, became more overt in their hostility. Where once they had avoided eye contact, now they stared openly, their faces a mixture of suspicion and resentment, as though convinced by Karen's narrative that Ethan's presence endangered their very homes. He overheard conversations cut short when he entered the local store, caught whispers branding him a speculator, an outsider, a man intent on profiting by tearing families from their foundations. The collective had succeeded in twisting the moral frame. He was no longer the heir defending his inheritance, but the villain attempting to unravel a community. Each hostile glance pressed against him like a physical weight, reminding him that truth and justice did not automatically generate sympathy. One evening, while reviewing paperwork at the guest house, Ethan found an envelope slipped under the door. Inside was no letter, only a photograph. His truck parked by the lake, the shot taken from an angle that suggested someone had been standing in the trees watching him. The message was wordless but unmistakable. You are being observed, every step cataloged, every move weighed. Laura urged him to file a police report, but when he did, the deputy shrugged, saying it was impossible to trace an anonymous photograph and suggesting instead that Ethan try to get along with the neighbors. The futility of the response deepened, his sense of isolation, reinforcing the suspicion that the collective's reach extended even into the institutions meant to uphold impartiality. Yet the most significant escalation arrived not through intimidation, but through strategy. Karen, no longer content with rent demands and notices, filed a formal counterclaim asserting adverse possession over portions of the land, citing the years of continuous use by the collective, the taxes paid by residents, and the infrastructure maintained without interference. The filing was dense, 30 pages of legal arguments woven together with references to precedents that painted Ethan as negligent, absent, and undeserving of the land. Laura called it aggressive but not unexpected. reminding him that the midpoint of their struggle had always pointed toward this confrontation. The collective was not bluffing. They were preparing for court, and they intended to present themselves as the rightful heirs of continuity against his fragile chain of paper. Reading the filing late into the night, Ethan felt the weight of what Karen had achieved. She had transformed theft into legitimacy, erasure into permanence, and in doing so she had rallied not only her neighbors but the machinery of law itself, which often preferred the appearance of stability over the disruption of correction. The second escalation was no longer about obstructed driveways or hostile stares. It was about rewriting history in a courtroom where judges measured reality not by memory, but by precedent, not by fairness, but by procedure. Ethan closed the file and leaned back, his eyes burning with exhaustion, and realized with chilling clarity that the fight had crossed a threshold. He was no longer defending a deed. He was defending the very idea that absence did not equal abandonment, that silence did not erase ownership. And he knew, with a certainty that both terrified and strengthened him, that the collective would not stop until every trace of his claim was erased. The courthouse smelled faintly of dust and varnish, a mix of old wood and older grievances, and as Ethan sat at the long table beside Laura, he felt the weight of 100 invisible eyes pressing on him, not only from the neighbors who had filled the benches behind Karen, but also from the silent expectation of the institution itself, which seemed to prefer resolution over truth, neatness over confrontation. Karen entered with the calm assurance of someone who had rehearsed every gesture, dressed in muted tones that suggested respectability, her hair pinned tightly, her folder tucked beneath one arm like a weapon she knew how to wield. She smiled at the residents who had followed her here, reassuring them with glances, reinforcing her role as protector of their homes against the intruder who dared to claim what they had built. Ethan caught the looks directed his way, eyes filled with fear and resentment, and he understood that to them this was not about paperwork or deeds, but about survival, about whether the roofs over their heads would remain or collapse under the gavel. The hearing began with Karen's attorney, a sharp-spoken man who moved quickly, presenting the collective's narrative with confidence. For more than a decade, the residents had lived openly on the land, paying taxes, maintaining infrastructure, raising families, and contributing to the community. He spoke of the doctrine of adverse possession, of stability as a public good, and of Ethan's absence as proof of negligence. He painted Ethan not as a rightful heir, but as an opportunist arriving late to reap what others had sown. The argument was polished, almost theatrical, and Ethan could see the judge leaning slightly forward, listening with the patience of someone accustomed to such narratives. Each sentence was another brushstroke painting him as the villain of a community's story. When it was their turn, Laura rose without theatrics, her voice steady but edged with controlled fire. She laid out the deed, the chain of ownership unbroken through generations, the letters his father had sent before his illness, and the county records acknowledging the family's continued taxation. Then she produced the flawed authorization, highlighting the impossible dates, the dissolved subcommittee, the designation of the land as vacant public, and the contradiction that undermined the entire foundation of the collective's claim. With each point, she drove a wedge between appearance and legality, forcing the court to see that what seemed stable was built on a document that should never have existed. The climax came when Laura introduced the anonymous letters, not as evidence of conspiracy but as context, showing how the collective had worked deliberately to maintain a facade of legitimacy while knowing their position was precarious. The judge allowed them into the record with caution, noting their anonymity, but the damage was done. The image of a grassroots neighborhood fighting for survival shifted, at least slightly, toward a portrait of coordination and manipulation. Ethan watched Karen's composure flicker, her smile tightening as Laura spoke of history erased, of inheritance disregarded, of a family's land turned into currency by those who had no rightful claim. When Ethan himself was called to speak, he resisted the urge to pour emotion into every word. Instead, he spoke slowly, describing the land as it had been, the stables his grandfather had built, the initials carved into limestone, the years his father struggled to keep the property alive even through illness. He did not accuse, did not rage. He simply told the story of continuity, of belonging, of memory tied to soil. For the first time, he saw the judge's expression soften, not in sympathy, but in recognition that the law was not only about statutes, but about context, about the lived weight of history. Karen's attorney tried to recover, waving maps and surveys, but the cracks had spread too far. The judge leaned back, tapped the gavel once against the desk, and announced that the provisional authorization was void, the deed valid, and the collective's adverse possession claim insufficient. The houses would not be torn down, but the land beneath them remained Ethan's, and any continued occupation would require lawful agreements with him. The words struck the room like a thunderclap, unraveling the certainty Karen had woven for years. Gasps rose from the benches, neighbors whispering, faces turning toward her with confusion and betrayal, and for the first time her smile vanished, replaced by a hard, pale mask. As the judge's decision echoed, Ethan felt no triumph, only a deep, exhausted release, the kind that left his hands trembling against the wood of the table. The war was not over. There would be appeals, negotiations, conflicts still to come, but the core had shifted, the tide broken. For the first time since returning, he was not the intruder in his own story. He was recognized, by law and by record, as what he had always been, the rightful heir of the land that bore his family's name. When the courthouse emptied and the echo of the gavel had faded into memory, Ethan stepped outside into the pale afternoon light with a sensation that felt less like victory and more like the first clean breath after nearly drowning. The air carried the smell of asphalt warmed by sun, the chatter of neighbors dispersing in clusters, their conversations sharp with accusation and disbelief, but none of it touched him in the same way anymore. For months he had been painted as a trespasser in his own story, an intruder on his own inheritance, and now the ground had shifted. Not completely, not with the neatness of a perfect ending, but enough to anchor him once more to the soil his. Grandfather had walked. Karen left quickly, her steps clipped, her figure retreating into the crowd without the authority she once wielded so easily. And though Ethan felt no triumph in her fall, he recognized the silence she left behind, a vacuum where her voice had dominated. In the weeks that followed, the collective fractured. Some residents approached Ethan with cautious humility, offering to negotiate leases or easements, not out of loyalty but out of necessity, their mortgages and investments tied too deeply to abandon. Others seethed quietly, their hostility lingering in narrowed eyes and curt words, but even they could no longer pretend Karen's version of the truth held weight. Ethan, guided by Laura's counsel, chose not to demand impossible restitution or to revel in punishment, but to set boundaries that were firm, lawful, and transparent. Agreements were drafted, contracts signed, and slowly the land that had been treated as vacant began to acknowledge its rightful continuity. For Ethan, the true resolution was not the paperwork or even the judge's ruling, but the moment he returned to the lake one evening, the water reflecting the sky in fractured silver, and crouched once more at the foundation stones of the old stable. His fingers traced the carved initials, the grooves worn but still intact, and he felt the chain of history settle into place again, not as a burden, but as a quiet assurance. He realized that his struggle had not been about defeating Karen or even about securing legal recognition, but about refusing to let silence erase what had been built before him. The ranch was no longer only memory. It was present, alive, bound to him in law and in story. And as he stood, the wind shifting across the valley, Ethan understood that while battles would always come, this one had ended with something rare. Not triumph, not destruction, but the simple restoration of what was rightfully his.